Qliphort has been an interesting archetype over its history in Yu-Gi-Oh! For there was a large span of time where it was a significant but almost sneakily competitive deck, bouncing between three major build strategies or win conditions. Towers Turbo, which used the once almost invincible towers to just dominate the field after summoning it as soon as possible. Bully, which used the pendulum mechanic, scout searching ability, and monolith's draw ability to just bum rush the field turn over turn, with the Qlis eventually overwhelming the opponent, and Qli stun demise, using card of demise and the pendulum mechanic to drop numerous anti-floodgate traps to the field, and then use the higher than average normal summoning capacity of the Qli monsters in addition to their statistics, especially through that normal summoning mechanic instead of the special summoning mechanic, to just push through the wind through a typically hobbled and stunned opponent. Unfortunately, as one can imagine, all three of these win condition strategies have fallen by the wayside in a sense. For a long period of time, Towers was banned, eliminating Towers Turbo, obviously, which was becoming a rather menace in the meta back then. It should have been banned, and while now it's come off of the ban list, the meta has evolved to the point where just putting towers on the field and then extending your hand, expecting the opponent to shake it and scoop, is no longer reasonable. The other two major win strategies have been effectively kneecapped by Master Rule 4. With the ability to only pendulum summon one monster from the extra deck, Qli Bully has lost a lot of its power, for no longer can it dump 2 to 4 monsters on the field per turn, either as straight rush monsters or as tribute fodder for higher level Qlis, and then just overwhelm the opponent. And despite a card like Climate Change, the loss of the extra deck swarming was too prohibitive to further that victory condition. With MR4 also moving the pendulum zones in competition with two back row zones, Demise Qli has been seriously wounded, for now the efficiency of Demise was hit, frequently costing cards from the hand and lost field position. Overall, it was certainly a dark time for Qliphorts after MR4 and before the release of Genius, because due to their xenophobic, in a sense, pendulum-based element, it was very difficult for Qliphorts to run any non-Qli-based Link monsters to attempt to produce some level of efficiency back to their pendulum summons. However, now with Genius available and Towers back in the fold, is it finally time for light to shine once again on Qliphort? Let's find out. Starting as I always do on first-time deck builds, we look at the existing archetype support. Back in the day, before MR4, Monolith was a rather subtle beast of a card, commonly allowing the Qliphort player to draw at least one, if not two additional cards per turn due to its Qli Tribute condition. However, now this draw aspect has been significantly slowed due to the lack of pendulum summoning availability. Furthermore, without the ability to normal summon itself from hand without tribute like the effect-based Qlis, it makes it somewhat inefficient to run 3 copies of Monolith or even multiple copies of Monolith. To that point, I only run 1 copy of Monolith, in part due to its searchability. There are numerous ways Monolith can be added to your hand if you want to set yourself up for a Monolith draw. Scout, one of the 2 most important cards in the deck. Overall, should Scout still be limited? No, it really should be either semi-limited or unlimited, but that is not the current situation. At the low cost of 800 life points per turn, it nets you a search of any Qli card, monster, spell, or trap, and because the effect has a soft once per turn, if you bounce Scout back to the hand with either Stealth or a certain rubberized cat, you can net yourself another search. Another advantage of Scout is that most forget or neglect that it is a scale 9. For relative to the scale 1s in the Qli archetype, the other scale 9s are kind of soft in their overall usefulness. They kind of backloaded the scale 1s. The scale 1s are the ones with all the effects you want, and when you get to the scale 9s, it's like, well, I guess Helix is good, but I'm not really a fan of Cephalopod or Shell as a 9. Can we make Stealth a 9 and Shell a 1? No? Oh, okay. However, understandably, Scout is certainly a magnet for opponent-based removal, and this deck definitely lacks protection element. So you really shouldn't expect to get multiple searches off of Scout very often. So in a sense, building the deck around trying to either protect or spam search Scout, not a great strategy anymore, because typically the opponent's just going to have way too many removal options and they'll just win that quote unquote arms race. Obviously, though, you definitely run the one available copy of Scout. Regardless of what some may say, Towers is still a great boss monster. The idea that it is a somewhat bad card now because there are a significantly increased number of outs than when it first terrorized the meta, that's just not practical. People are overestimating the ability of cards like Borreload Dragon or Underclock Taker to out Towers. Unfortunately, while Towers is still a beast when it hits the field, the issue of hitting the field has become the problem. MR4 hurt the summoning capacity of Towers for a vast majority of the time. Towers was summoned off the back of at least 2 Pendulum summoned Cleaves if Saqlifice wasn't involved. That is not to say that summoning Towers is still not possible or it's just such a hurdle it's not worth running, because Genius does exist, and Genius has done a lot to significantly move the bar back to, hey, Towers is still a viable boss monster. From those dark times of after MR4 and before Genius existed, when summoning Towers was incredibly difficult. While some may argue that Please End is also a viable Towers, we'll get to why that's not a great strategy in my eyes a little later. While first turn Towers is still possible, it is more advisable to aim for a second turn Towers now after you felt out your opponent's deck a little and come to an understanding of what they may have and what they may not have in order to try out Towers. Obviously, I do run the one allowable copy of Towers because while it's not as good as it once was thanks to MR4, part of my mindset is, why are you running Qliphort at all if you don't run the quote-unquote Big Daddy himself? Skybase is the Jan Brady of the Qliphort family, for Towers sucked a lot of the air out of the room when it came to what boss monster to run in the deck. Unfortunately, while Skybase is probably given a little more grief than it should, there are certainly valid reasons it should have been passed over. The biggest issue with Skybase is, at the same rather steep cost of 3 Qliphort monsters, Skybase only has 29 attack, which is an unfortunate amount. Also, its effect is less game-breaking in a sense, as a once per turn, non-quick play, ends at the end of the turn change of heart, rather than a force the opponent to dump a monster from the hand or field to the graveyard once per turn effect that Towers has. So there is valid reason behind why Skybase was so forgotten. Stealth was once the biggest threat of the 2 tribute monsters with its bounce ability and the inability of the opponent to respond to it. While still a great card, I feel Stealth's position as the #1 tribute monster has been usurped by one of its allies. However, I run 2 copies, for it is still an important attacking element in the deck. Shell is another one of those shadow Qliphort monsters, for it does not have removal like Stealth, has no swarming capacity like Disk, but it still costs those 2 tributes to bring it out to the field if you want its effect. Shell's multiple attack aspect can be useful from time to time, and its piercing ability can be periodically useful, I guess, but anyone familiar with my deck builds knows I am certainly not a fan of piercing. Overall, the most valuable aspect of Shell may be the fact that it's a scale 9. I run 1 copy. Disk is probably the card that benefited the most from the release of Genius due to its summons from the deck ability. Before Genius came along, when you tribute summoned a Disk, you summoned from your deck, you swung with those 2 additional 1800 attackers, Maybe you used one or both as tribute fodder during your main phase 2 if you had something like Laser on the field. Otherwise, you lost them to the extra deck, which before MR4 came along, who cares? I'll just get them back during a later turn. But in that era before Genius, but after MR4, due to the significant limited extra deck summoning capacity of Qli's, those two cards you brought out with Disk were almost lost in a sense to the extra deck. So you got your extra damage in, you thinned your deck a little, but you didn't have that significant advantage that you gained in the past with Disk. However, now that Genius has come along, you can simply use those two summoned monsters to summon Genius during main phase 2, and if you have not Pendulum summoned during the current turn, summon those two Genius tributes back to the field, creating significant greater field presence. Overall, Disk's OTK and Genius summoning capacity makes it more critical to the deck than it's ever been before. I run 3 copies. Cephalopod is like Shell, one of the forgotten Qliphorts, despite a solid effect that both increases your life points and burns the opponent by 300 times the surplus of monsters in your opponent's graveyard relative to your graveyard monsters. Seeing that you're running a Pendulum deck, you're not going to have a lot, if any, monsters in your graveyard. When Qliphorts were first released, the game was not nearly as fast as it is now, which made sense that Cephalopod's effect, which relies on graveyard differences between both players, rather ineffective. However, now the effect has become somewhat important, with the graveyard filling speed of a number of decks that you'll be facing when you pilot Qli's. Overall, I run 3 copies. Now, the effect itself is not worth 3 copies, but that 9 scale for Cephalopod is better, in my opinion, than Shell, for I prefer Cephalopod's effect over Shell. Helix is the best 9 scale after Scout, only costing a single tribute and having a nice spell trap destruction effect when tributed, period. Not just tributed for a Qliphort summon, opening some solid flexibility in how you'd want to design the deck. This effect can become rather annoying for the opponent due to the pendulum nature of Helix. It was incredibly annoying back in the day before MR4 because you could just keep spamming out Helixes. However, now that Master Rule 4 has shut a little of that flexibility down, Helix is still good. Its annoyance factor for the opponent has gone down significantly. Not much else to say about Helix other than it's a solid card, it can cause some major damage to the opponent's back row, and 3 copies are pretty much a must. In contrast to Helix, Carrier is the other single tribute effect monster in the group that handles the opponent's monsters versus the back row that Helix disposes of. In some respects, Carrier is the baby Stealth with its monster bounce ability when tributed. Along with Helix, Carrier makes up the backbone of the initial Qliphort invasion force. 3 copies are also a must. I almost want to pipe in some of Beethoven's Ode to Joy here, because enter Genius, the card that takes Qliphorts out of the Dark Ages and into the Link era. Genius is a solid card. As previously mentioned, Genius significantly enhances the usefulness of Disk. Genius has the spell and trap immunity of the heavy hitters of the Qli family at a much lower effective cost, in addition to the ability to shrug off the effects of Link monsters. However, at only 1800 attack, it can be a little squishy. Its negation effect can be useful for both neutralizing threats on board and boosting the attack of other Qliphort monsters. Obviously, we have to make the note, shame it's not quick play, but certainly understandable. Unfortunately, not being a quick play effect does hurt, but it's still something that is useful. It's just not some throwaway effect. Finally, it has a nice and rather consistent searching effect that takes some of the pressure off of the only one available copy of Scout for netting pluses, but unfortunately it does only work with monsters rather than all Qli cards like Scout. While Genius only needs 2 machine monsters to actually put itself on the field, it is rather difficult to expect to summon it using non-Qli means, or while cards like Draconoid Generator or Mecha Phantom Beast Tetherwolf can certainly get the job done by themselves, the anti-special summoning ability of the Qli's when you have any Qli in a pendulum zone can really hurt the non-first turn capacity of those cards, and putting Genius on the field first turn isn't great most of the time. You have to have the right cards in hand for a first turn Genius really to excel. So while running cards like Draconoid Generator or Tetherwolf is certainly possible, I would advise you do so at your own risk because they can be kind of bricky or not very useful later on in the duel. Overall, closing the book on Genius, as mentioned, it's a solid card that reopens the door to Qli's success by allowing them to tap once again into that extra deck with some real level of efficiency now. It certainly is not the god card that something like Electromite is for Magicians, but definitely useful. Overall, I run 3 copies because it's Genius, you need 3 copies, and realistically, it's not like your extra deck doesn't have the space. While Scout remains at a single copy, fortunately, Saqlifice has returned to 3 copies, which makes a huge difference in Qli's success. Largely, it was thought to have been limited due to the fact that it had just had so many positive effects. The 300 attack boost for Qli monsters, which is more than just a shrug of the shoulders, oh, it's just 300, it's something that's more cosmetic than anything, because so many of the Qlis, especially when they're normal summoned with Tribute, exist around those critical attack point beat junction, so that 300 boost is actually a much bigger boost than it might otherwise seem. Saqlifice also granted the ability to not be destroyed by battle, which created a much more significant element of field control for the Qli monsters. It's treated as a double tribute for Qli monster summoning. This is incredibly important in the deck. Before MR4, in that dark period, and even now, and it nets a Qli monster search when it goes to the graveyard. And it's difficult for Saqlifice not to end up in the graveyard once it's been played. Overall, there really is nothing to be said about Saqlifice other than it's a fantastic card that you should always run 3 copies of. And it should frequently be your search target for Scout unless a very specific situation exists that demands a different card. In the golden era of Qliphort, before the dark times of MR4, Laser Qlip was viewed as almost, really? This is its effect? Why couldn't this card have had a much more useful effect? The ability to have a second normal summons? Not really useful. I'm backed up by the pendulum mechanic. Now, with the hindrance of MR4 and the arrival of Genius, Laser has become a much more viable option in a Qliphort deck. Unfortunately, I do not like running this card at multiple copies because I find it still reliant on the number of Qliphorts in hand, which definitely can be dicey from time to time, especially after turn 1. And because first turn Genius, as previously mentioned, really isn't super critical to the deck. It's not like first turn Electromite. To that end, I like running only 1 copy that can be searched out via Scout when appropriate. If climate change was a spell, it would be amazing. But as a trap, it's just frequently too slow, especially now that a card like Pendulum Paradox exists in the game. Change was a valid choice back in the day, although one I kind of disagreed with. But now, if you really want to recover Scout from the extra deck, just run Paradox. Qliph's End is just a disappointing card for 2 reasons. First, while it protects all Qli spells and traps from destruction the turn it's activated, there are a number of other options that don't destroy now, so trying to chain it to evade Scout destruction is not as great as you initially think, because typically a Cosmic Cyclone might just be coming down to wipe out your Scout, and there's nothing End can do about it. It really would have been much nicer if this card had protected all spells and traps from being removed from the field instead, but oh well. And it's not like that would have been overpowered either. To almost rub salt in the wounds, End, when it's put on the field, no longer counts itself as a trap card, so in a sense, almost ironically, it doesn't protect itself with its own effect. Facepalm. Second, and more importantly, while it can count as 3 tributes for towers or skybase, the entire premise behind its existence. It cannot be used as a single tribute entity to summon a level 7 or 8 Qliphort monster. Basically, it either acts as 3 tributes for towers or skybase, or 1 tribute for any other Qli monster. This lack of diversity really kills the utility of the card, but because it only counts for towers, which is at 1, and skybase you probably don't run, or just any old run-of-the-mill monster, and its protection effect is somewhat substandard, as I said, just disappointing. As they say, almost every archetype has the runt of the litter, as it were, and launch is certainly the runt of the Qliphort litter. For the protection effect is not useful for anything important, already has spell or trap immunity, or can just be easily recovered from the extra deck, or you have multiple copies of, so keeping it on the field isn't, oh gee, my entire duel is swinging on this one monster. The effect negation can be interesting, but it's far too situational to be useful, and the overall usefulness of the card is just substandard. Recreate is basically a pseudo archetype specific skill drain for the deck, and while the card does have its moment, overall it is really just outclassed, in my opinion, by a more generic card like Lose One Turn. Obviously, the problem is that the effect is only negated until the end of the turn rather than permanently, which allows a card like Lose One Turn to outclass it. Also, the card can be somewhat fragile due to the need to have a Qli card on the field for maintenance. Well, that closes the book on the direct overall support. The big problem right now, in my opinion, Qli's face is, even with the return of Towers and the emergence of Genius, is they really don't produce a lot of pluses and advantages outside of Scout. Granted, Saqlifice, Genius, and Monolith can also generate pluses, but those pluses are not nearly as consistent or as versatile. At their core, Qlis right now are a control deck, and in a sense had a reaction to MR4 similar to Ignites, in that they were really reliant on the pendulum mechanic to create a lot of their advantage. With this in mind, what strategy should round out the deck? Qlis can swarm, but not with a lot of power, because 1800 is solid, but it's nothing really to write home about. So the idea for the deck, in my opinion, should be to try to control the board and produce swarm openings. So to achieve this goal, the rest of the monsters are rounded out by nothing. This is a Qli-only deck for me because due to the importance of the normal summons for Qli, the nature of Saqlifice, and the anti-special summoning nature of the pendulum conditions of Qli, one thing you can definitely do is, if you're interested, is find some masterpieces. You can throw some masterpieces in there, but then you have to adjust the back row and look for some more continuous spells and traps to also augment its summoning conditions, and that can change the deck in a very significant fashion. For the remaining spells, I run 1 copy of Raigeki and 1 copy of Darkhole for spell-based field clearance, 3 copies of Summoner's Art for, while it can be a dead draw later in the duel due to only having 2 search targets, hitting Scout is certainly first priority in this deck. Art is definitely a good way to grab it, despite those Ash Blossoms that might be running around. Finally, I run 1 copy of Monarchs Stormforth for removal purposes. For the traps, I go heavy with my design philosophy in mind, with field clearance, 3 copies of Torrential Tribute, 3 copies of Blind Obliteration for dealing with monsters before links can hit the field, as Obliteration can do nothing against link monsters, and the high-level standing of the Qliphort monsters when they're tributed can commonly ward off the destruction effect of Obliteration, 1 copy of the obligatory skill drain, and 1 copy of Solemn Judgment. Finally, that leaves me with 3 free deck spaces. Obviously, the best choice is probably 3 copies of Evenly Matched due to its blowout nature, and in my opinion, Qliphort does want to favor going second because it really can't produce a amazing try to break this board going first, and first turn Towers, as mentioned, is certainly not that amazing anymore. However, if you cannot afford the Evenly Matched, Then I like a card like Lost Wind for multiple effect negation, attack reduction of key monsters, or you could go even a little risky and run 3 copies of Anti-Spell Fragrance because Qli's aren't as invested in having to Pendulum Summon as a lot of other Pendulum Summon based decks. For the extra deck, I run the aforementioned 3 copies of Genius and basically run whatever else you want if you want to run anything. I would throw in maybe a couple copies of number 103 Ragna 0 because with Laser, you can normal summon a pair of Qlis from your hand without needing to drop any scales. Seeing that those Qlis have been normal summoned, they'll drop their level to 4. You can make a 103. Then you can slap down a scale 9 in a pendulum zone that's not Scout, drop your opponent monster's attack by 300, opening them up to 103's effect. And during your turn, you can pop one, and then if they still have a monster at the start of your opponent's turn, you can pop a second. Outside of these choices of Genius and maybe Ragna 0, as been alluded to and mentioned before, the extra deck is kind of needless for Qliphorts. In the end, I feel this type of deck is the best way to run Qliphorts right now because without the Pendulum mechanic at its full power anymore, it is more of a control deck than a swarm deck or a turbo deck due to the lack of major advantage gaining strategies and the fact that Scout will tend to die fairly quickly, even if it does hit the field. Towers is still a beast when it hits the field, but it needs to hit the field beyond turn 1 more often than on turn 1. Overall, Qliphorts can still be a solid competitive deck in this meta due to the board clears it can run, the strength of their tribute effects, and the general annoyance of a card like Saqlifice, forcing the opponent to make little more extended or stronger plays than he or she might otherwise want to make to rid the field of those monsters that are being backed by Saqlifice. Well, that is my Qliphort deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.